हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू माय चैनल। आज हम पढ़ेंगे डिलन थॉमस। ठीक है। डिलन थॉमस से पहले जीएम हॉपकिंस जो थे, वो ही वाज द प्रीकर्सर ऑफ मॉडर्न पोइट्री। W. Beats, T.S. Eliot, and Ezra Pound were the major poets of the first quarter of this century. W. H. Auden represented the 30s. After that came Dylan Thomas and Philip Larkin. They represented the 40s and the 50s respectively. तो डिलन थॉमस के बारे में पढ़ते हैं. मॉडर्निज्म इन इंग्लिश पोइट्री reflected post-war disillusionment, the impact of science and industrial society and elite cosmopolitanism. Literary movements like symbolism, imagism, classism, surrealism, and socialism, etc., contributed to its emergence. Uh, okay, traditional verse forms and the paraphrasable content of poetry were rejected. Consequently, new poetry characterized by free verse, missing syntactic links and recondite allusions, recondite मतलब not clear allusions, became obscure. Obscure का मतलब होता है कि वो unclear थे, है ना, and difficult for the common reader. But the cinema, radio, television, and other new audiovisual means of mass communication posed a challenge to the elite tendency. Class and mass culture clashed. Uh, Dylan Thomas was a product of this clash or tension. His love for words and language was inspired by nursery rhymes, folk tales, ballads, hymns, the rhythm of the Bible, Blake's Songs of Innocence, and Shakespeare. With his love of rhetoric, he played the game of language with a romantic sincerity, a dazzling brilliance, and a baffling theatricality, which just fell short of achieving the vision of the mature poet who is focused on life within and beyond language. Lord Byron and D.H. Lawrence, Dylan Thomas had become a legendary figure in his lifetime. He made poetry a performing art. His poetry was lyrical and sometimes enigmatic in a challenging manner about sex, death, and religion. Enigmatic means बोलते हैं कि puzzling. The most conscious craftsman about Eliot, he allowed a dreamlike association of images, many of them taken from childhood memories, to form the connecting thread on which a poem was to be hung. His innovations, like Hopkins, are verbal, textual more than structural. But his pride in his talent was mitigated. Was mitigated means just reduced by his sense of humor and irony. He loved acting and showing off. A celebrated broadcaster and a fascinating reader of poems, Lai was a forerunner of the angry young man of the 50s. He was believed to have led a guerrilla attack on the classism of Eliot and Auden and on the intellectual dominance of London, Oxford, Cambridge, and Harvard. His romantic revolt unleashed means released a coarseness and richness of language, a reveling in comedy and bawdry. Bawdry means भोंडापन या है ना, an affirmation of the holy myths rather than a sniveling at God, rather than sniveling means rona dona, and an augury of the irrational, celebration of the irrational. He celebrated life in his poetry. In the famous author's prologue to his collected poems, he said that he wrote for the love of man and in praise of God. However, his status as a poet remained controversial for about 2 decades after his death. Donald Davy accused him of abandoning the task of articulation and indulging in pseudo syntax. कुछ लोगों ने, जैसे कि डोनाल्ड डेवी ने उनके बारे में ऐसा बोला था. फिर C.H. सीजन फाउंड द उनका मतलब उन्होंने क्या बोला था, फाउंड द obscurity of his poetry a willed effect and described his supposed lack of development as boring. According to him, Thomas is historically important as the prototype of much of the literary pretensions of the 1940s. उसके बाद आते हैं डेविड हॉलब्रुक, also noticed a disabling immorality in his poetry, leading towards the trivial and ultimately the inarticulate. His verbal impotence rejected his failure to grow up and accept adult potency. But John Wayne बोलते हैं, argued that the open emotionalism, the large verbal gestures which seemed more rant, the rapt pleasure in elaborate craftsmanship, and above all, the bardic tone of Thomas' poetry derived from his Welshness. Lewis Simpson बोलते हैं, preferred this bardic tone to the dry discourse of later Auden. Thomas' physicality, his musical sounds and visual imagery, and his contempt for respectability magnetized American poetry, leading to the legendary success of Ginsberg's reading of Howl in San Francisco in 1955. C.B. Cox maintained, C.B. Cox बोलते हैं कि Thomas' rhetoric derives forward, often in anguish and rage, in a desperate attempt to overcome the fact of personal extinction. His bardic gestures are celebrated acts of defiance. Dylan Thomas passionately wanted to believe in the magic of this burning and bewildering universe, in the meaning and the power of symbols, in the miracle of myself and at all mortals, in the divinity that is so near us or longing to be nearer, in the staggering, bloody, starry world of sky, wonder of the sky. So ये हो गया इनका. अब इनका ब्रीफ लाइफ स्केच हम थोड़ा पढ़ेंगे. डायलिन मार्लाइस थॉमस 1914 में इनका जन्म हुआ और 53 में इनकी डेथ हो गई थी. वॉज बॉर्न ऑन 27 अक्टूबर in 1914 at Swansea in South Wales, where his father D.J. Thomas was a teacher of English in Swansea Grammar School. Fernhill and Poem in October, two of his famous poems, suggest that his childhood was happy. The sea and the woods provided a pastoral setting to his mind and imagination. He wrote, तो उन्होंने लिखा, I was born in a large Welsh industrial town at the beginning of the Great War. An ugly, lovely town, crawling, sprawling, slumped, unplanned, jerry-villaed, and smug suburbed by the side of a long and splendid curving shore, where truant boys and anonymous old men in the litter and hangover of 100 charity suits, beach-combed, idled and paddled, watched the dock-bound boats, and threw stones into the sea for barking outcast dogs. Now, Dylan Thomas, notice the infatuations with words, and the stylistic peculiarity of fondness for epithets and compounds. किस तरह की उन्होंने language use की है. At the age of 17, he began writing and joined the school of South Wales Evening Post as a reporter. He wrote mainly on literary subjects and published poems as well. In 1933, he wrote the poem "The Force that through the green fuse drives the flower," which published in 1934 won him instant fame. He moved to London in 1934. There writing for films and broadcasting for the BBC. His recitals of poems on the radio or on gramophone records were magical, magnetic, electrifying. His warm, powerful voice and his bardic intensity made many poems sound greater than ever before. But in London, Lai felt strange and lived a bohemian life. In 1937, he married Kathleen McNamara, a niece of Augustus John, the painter, and went to live with his bride in Logarne. So they had no money but were in complete happiness. So बोलते हैं, I have achieved, he wrote, poverty with distinction, but never poverty with dignity. The best I can manage is dignity with poverty. A weekly allowance from an admirer, James from USA, helped him survive. He hated London. It was to him an insane of the restless dead. This seems to echo T.S. Eliot's famous echo of Dante in the wasteland. He had not thought death had undone so many. Another admirer, Margaret Taylor, wife of the famous historian A.J.P. Taylor, patronized him continually, finally gifting a house at Logarne to the poet, whose last years were divided between the American tours and the peace at home. Now, John Malcolm Brennan arranged his hectic American lecture tours. In the last 3.5 years of his life, he made 4 visits to the USA. His readings of poems by Yeats, Hardy, Auden, and Lawrence McNeice, Ellen Lewis, Edith Sitwell, and his own poems received wild ovations. The poet acted the clown in his own tragedy. Finally, he succumbed like a mesmerized bait, only in this case a short legged one of the multitudinous scavenging pawn of America. He died of excessive drinking and various illnesses in New York on 9th November 1953. Playing the enfant terrible, the playboy of the Western world killed him. He liked snobbishly to believe that lie that he was tubercular like Keats, ate like him, fated to die young. Now, the attraction of America was irresistible for Dylan Thomas as it had been for W. H. Auden. Auden had admired its openness and lack of tradition. मतलब अमेरिका को वो इतना पसंद करते थे. थॉमस फर्स्ट विजिट टू द यूएसए वाज अ रोरिंग सक्सेस एंड अ सक्सेस. He seemed the fat Rimbaud come again, villain and more. The romantic poet in his ecstasy and agony. His audience understood him as a mob understands its leader without necessarily taking in his words. They knew this is poetry and it is for them. The poet was playing to the gallery, but he set his listeners alive by his voice of elation and anguish ringing over their heads. Thomas' love for America was described by Carl Piro as grisly for its being the untraditional place, the romantic country par excellence. अब उनकी पोइट्री और इन पोइट के बारे में हम नेक्स्ट वीडियो में रीड करेंगे क्योंकि ये काफ़ी बड़ा है आगे भी ना. थैंक यू सो मच.